Average viewers won't understand your video because your speech is too complicated, self-important, and arrogant. All right, originally I was going to go through all the comments, but I've already responded to them a lot in writing. If you want to continue the dialogue there, I'm happy to do that. Yeah, I definitely appreciate all the feedback. It's been really helpful in sort of deciding what direction I want to take this, and I've got a lot written already, and it's helped me to sort out which ones I want to bring to the front. And knowing that some of these next topics will open up even more rabbit holes, I can sort of anticipate what questions are going to come up. So I've got something of a queue worked up, ready to go. So there are a few comments I haven't responded to, and I'm going to get to them now. I just want to be clear, I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not piling on anyone. Some of these are funny. Some of them are ridiculous. I'm going to try to be as serious as possible through all of them. All right, so Denelson83 says, it's because of cars. Yeah, sort of. I mean, that's a really easy answer. I think there's a lot more nuance to it than that, which is kind of why I made the video in the first place. Yeah, and it's kind of, the title of my channel. People kind of make up stories because they're easy to repeat and they're easy to remember. I don't know, they feel good, but lots of places have cars and they don't have the same issues, right? And even within the English-speaking countries that we talked about, things aren't exactly the same. Even though the histories are super similar, you wind up with slightly different outcomes. You can look at the UK or the Netherlands, France. You see a lot of the same stuff, but the transit ridership is wildly different, right? Decisions were made about infrastructure 50, 70, 80 years ago that affect us today. And that's kind of the point. Like, if we want to fix any of those problems, we really need to get down to like the nitty gritty of how they got to be that way, the systems that support them, the cars, I mean, and then what gets supported by roads and highways. Like, you can't just undo one thing without, potentially causing an avalanche of other problems. Mostly guesses, 8385. Pretty big comment here. He's basically saying that, his grandfather's from Minnesota. He said the Canadians were far poorer, back in the 1950s or 40s, whenever. And basically saying about their incomes are about a third lower. And also saying even in France or Italy, only 10% of all workers get transit to work. That's actually a pretty good point. It is pretty accurate. And I'm going to be talking about this a lot coming up because it's important, right? So much of the transit ridership in France is in Paris. So much of it. And even within Paris, like metropolitan Paris, most of that transit ridership is in the city. Like, 65, 70% of the metropolitan Paris population lives outside of the city. And most of those people drive to work. Yeah, I'll talk about the numbers more in depth in the next couple of videos, but yeah, it's definitely accurate. 10% walk or bike. I think that number actually might be a little bit lower than that, and the rest is car. Also saying, so in all Western countries, the car won. I don't really see it as like zero sum like that. Every mode has a niche. Instead of like fighting this war or one against the other, we should be promoting it where each mode is more practical. A lot of older cities, especially in Europe, it's really hard to fit transit in, and that's where you want to promote walking. And I mean, you already do see that. No one, like I was in Milan and we took a day trip up to Bergamo, and it's this little old medieval town basically. You're not fitting any buses down any of those streets. You've got to walk. People dislike waiting. They don't like cold wind. Yeah, I mean that's true if you're in Minnesota. About half of U.S. people in 1900 rode a horse wagon, didn't walk. Listen, before cars, people walked a lot, and they walked far, even when horses and wagons were around. Like, not everybody could afford one. It's ridiculously expensive to stable a horse, and that's why electric streetcars took off. I mean, because horse-drawn cars had been around for almost 300 years before the electric streetcar was invented, and they weren't nearly as ubiquitous because of how much money it costs to stable a horse. I mean, for every streetcar, you basically needed 8 horses. You would have 2 pulling the streetcar and then 6 in the stable, and you would just rotate the horses out. Insanely expensive. Sort of asking, didn't Canada have a smaller baby boom than the U.S.? So U.S. needed suburbs more. I don't know that the Canadian baby boom was smaller. Like, people had fewer kids, maybe, but the population was way smaller. So, I mean, yeah, they're like proportionally, I don't know that it was different. Like, regardless, Canada just had way more room to expand at the time. And it did. There was a pretty big suburban boom in the 1950s in Canada. I mean, you can see that all around Toronto for sure, and in Montreal as well. And geez, yeah, even in Vancouver and Victoria, I've been to both of those places, and you can definitely see it once you get outside of downtown, where that 1950s suburban expansion was. That it's not even really different in Australia either. Transit mostly helps those 4 miles from downtown. Yeah, kind of true. I mean, it really depends on the size of the city. In a city like Toronto, I think that's easily 10 miles. And really, when you start to get into like the GO trains, regional rail, that's you're talking more like 30 miles. You know, that might only be 5% of suburban workers who are taking the train to work downtown, but that's 5% of people who aren't on the highways. Basically, density in actual life matters. Is most Mr. X's friends, shops, eateries, and work within walking. And due to suburbs, this will never occur for most. See, I don't really agree there. In fact, in the U.S. anyway, the average American lives something like 3.5 miles from, 2.8 miles from the nearest supermarket. But they shop at one that's 3.5 miles from where they live. So when you start talking about daily conveniences, that gets down to under 2 miles. So I don't like walking and cycling. For a lot of people is actually pretty easy distance-wise. It's just that the infrastructure isn't there, and that's why people aren't using it. I'm not trying to say that everyone's going to ride their bike to the grocery store. I'm just saying that you could easily get a mode shift where you see 5 to 10% of cycling for non-work trips. Walking is the test. Waiting for a bus or tram is hated waiting time. I thank this video for stressing U.S.-built suburbs fast, unlike the rest of the West, behind a generation. So timing, not mentality, made the U.S. different. Yeah. Thank you for picking that up. That was definitely my point. But 80% of French and Finnish workers drive to work. Yeah, that's still true. Personally, I'm not trying to say that everyone should take the train to work. It really depends on where you live. A small town is not going to be able to afford a big transit system, and most people are going to wind up driving to work. His grandma wanted to act rich, and she didn't want to seem poor, so a car was a status symbol, basically. And yeah, I mean, it still is. I mean, they're marketed that way. It's not how I feel about it, but a lot of people do. And then he's saying, and be honest, U.S. cities have more violence and minorities. This is going to come up again later. And this actually isn't true. Violence in U.S. cities didn't really become a problem until like the late 50s, early 60s. And even then, that's when it started to rise. It wasn't really bad until the late 60s, early 70s. I think that's the other part, right? Is like people confuse the times when these things happened. People in the U.S. didn't really notice that suburban exodus was happening until the late 60s, right? But at that point, it was already almost 20 years old. The Exodus happened way before any of the riots or the violence of the late 60s and early 70s. Like, it was almost complete at that point. And if anything, you could point to that as a cause of it, not a reaction to it. Yeah, as for like the racial stuff, no. Because these things happened at the same time everywhere, all over the world. Tram companies weren't failing in the 1960s in Chicago and Brisbane at the same time because of what? Like, the demographics were never the same. So yeah, it's just a silly premise and has no grounding in reality. All right, so, and then he's saying, as me, the only white guy on a Houston bus, I doubt transit will work now. It's still seen as for poor losers. Yeah, in some Sunbelt cities, that's still kind of the case for some people, I guess, if you're in the suburbs. I mean, I live in the Sunbelt. I'm riding my bike to work now, but when I was working further away, I was taking the train, and I never really encountered that. I mean, even sometimes when I take the bus to work, people are more curious than anything. I never heard anyone say anything that would suggest that they think less of me for it. And even like people not knowing that that's how I get to work, I just don't hear a lot of that. Like, I know it's out there. I think it's maybe like a holdover from the 80s, maybe. I don't think it's really like very big as like a modern opinion. Shizune Hakamichi says this video, sorry if I got your name wrong. This video has screwed up audio channels right from the beginning. Yep. I know. I'm working on that. Hopefully I've got it sorted out for this one. If not, hopefully it's going to get a little bit better with each video. Definitely trying. I'm new to Final Cut Pro and still trying to figure everything out. Okay, Waco Bob 56 Dad says Americans will not give up their cars. Mass transit is for inner city workers. Yeah, I mean, both of those things can be true, right? And I don't really see a problem with either of them. Like, I have a car, don't plan on giving it up. Doesn't mean I don't take the bus to work, and I don't live. I work downtown. I don't live there. Real not Oreo, or real not Oreo. One thing worth pointing out is Australia's population growth pattern. Firstly, until 1971, only white immigrants were allowed into Australia. So a lot of that 50s to 80s car primetime Australia's population didn't receive all too many immigrants. Okay, so slow growth, if I'm following this right, slow growth in terms of population. So there was not a lot of, there's not a big suburban boom. At this time, there was a shift in mindset, and Australia did see rail improvements at this time, such as Melbourne City Loop and an upgraded ticketing system. Flash forward to a few decades where the mindset has switched more towards transit. The population is really beginning to pick up. In 2002, for example, the country was expected to grow to 26 million by 2050. Guess what? We already surpassed that. So a lot more growth will be justification for transit, not cars, compared to the U.S. Yeah, agreed. But I think at this point, the U.S. has exceeded the limits of car infrastructure, and that most of our big metro areas, and I would say like maybe the 30 largest, they can't really grow much beyond how they've already sprawled. And the only thing that they can do is to add capacity to the network by adding transit and to build more densely around those transit lines. Like, that's the only way that most of these places will be able to grow. It's just got to be done. Unfortunately, it's kind of backwards, but that's where we are now. Kind of a different topic, something I saw on Twitter today, unfortunately. This is actually over rent prices and people conflating a rise in rents with a rise in population, and it's not. It's a rise in households. A household growth can happen independently of population growth. All it takes is a roommate moving out, and then you go from one household to two. A lot of people live alone now because they have the money to, and that's it's kind of a problem. The population growth or the household growth in the U.S. has been absolutely insane. Over the last 23 years, the number of households that we've added are equivalent to all of the housing in California, Arizona, Nevada, Washington, and Oregon. Crazy. Something like 27 million houses. Austin Surson says, many good points for sure. I can't fully speculate on the past, but present reality in Calgary, as most people think public transit is a good thing and helps reduce traffic and congestion while also creating vibrancy. There have been some recent setbacks with social disorder over the pandemic. The trucker protests, maybe? I don't know. But ridership is almost completely recovered post-pandemic. Yeah, that's a ridership recovery has been hurting in a lot of cities, and it appears to be pretty bad in Australia too. On the whole, I'd still say most Calgarians see the value in having it available, if only to attend a major sporting event. Yeah, I mean, it's not really that different in most big U.S. cities. And, even in Dallas or L.A., people will take the train to get downtown. Like San Diego, people see the value in it, even if they don't use it all the time. It's not like, I don't like to pick on anybody, but it's not like we're talking about Woodland, Texas here, or what's the place in between Dallas and Fort Worth where the stadiums are? It doesn't have any transit. Yeah, that place. Meanwhile, in the States where I grew up, I really came across people that valued the municipal public transportation system. Yeah, I mean, I think this happens a lot where people come from like a small town or like a small city or a suburb on the outskirts of a bigger city, and then they move to a city, like they'll move to New York, or they'll move to Boston or to Calgary or to Amsterdam, and like, oh, well, we don't have this in my part of the country, or we don't have this in the U.S. But yeah, like we do. It's just not everywhere. Just like, you go to some small town in Spain and you're not going to be taking the train everywhere. Like back in my school days, I was in Northern Ireland for 2 weeks, and it's kind of like an exchange program. Yeah, there were like a couple buses a day that would get us into Belfast so that we could get the train back to Dublin. But otherwise, we drove everywhere. There was no transit. And I don't know what the situation is like now, but I've been plenty of rural and small town places in Europe where it's not as easy as people make it out to be. And I'm not saying that it's not, like, the situation is not better than the US. I'm just saying that it's not perfect. Here we go again. There's a far deeper social dynamic at play in the States, largely rooted in racism/classism and white flight, among other housing geographic related issues. Yeah, I mean, it's super easy for people to fall back on that, and they can kind of use that to explain everything. But in reality, most of the people have the timing backwards. Like a lot of people aren't even aware of the Great Migration, let alone when it happened. Suburbanization basically started immediately in the post-World War I period. So from 1919 to 1929, you had something like 900,000 homes a year being built in the suburbs. And that's when the U.S. population was about a third of what it is now. That got interrupted because of the Great Depression and then World War I. So you had this 20-year period where nothing was happening. But as soon as people had a little bit of money in their pocket, they went right back to what they were doing before. And that was living in the suburbs and driving a Model T. I kind of touched on this a little bit about like the sort of decay in some U.S. cities compared to Canada or Australia. I think it's really down to the settlement patterns, access to water, and other like early access to navigable waterways, right? Like Canada, you've got the St. Lawrence. There's not really another big navigable river. The U.S. has a lot of them, and there were cities everywhere. There are cities everywhere, and there's almost 360 U.S. metro areas at 100,000 or more. Australia has 19, and I think Canada has fewer than 40. You can't really pick up shop and move to a different city. Like, if steel production moves, and I'm going to do a video on this, but if the center of steel production shifted to another part of Canada, like what would happen? Or if it happened in Australia, if like all of a sudden these huge iron ore deposits were discovered on the west coast somewhere, like nowhere near Perth, everyone would have to basically leave Newcastle and move out to the west coast, which would be totally devastating for Newcastle. I don't know, maybe Australia's a bad example because it's basically an island and you can just ship around the coast. It's far, but it's not impossible. It's a little bit more difficult to do in the U.S. And when steel production shifted to Charlotte because of Nucor Steel, the auto industry followed it. And like what, when you can get half price steel, what are you going to do? And I mean, it's not really any different, like with what's happened in Australia more recently with the offshoring of industry, with the auto industry basically left Australia, and it's been pretty devastating to Geelong especially. I do like the idea of a highway project being called the Downtown Penetrator. Darkwood movies. I think the American case is actually really simple. America's incredibly rich, even if these days we don't see that wealth because it's concentrated at the top. We can easily afford highways and even public transit. Real issue is the culture, manipulated by corporate PR agents and the government representatives, lobbied by them. USA doesn't have trains, not because we can't fund them or even that it would be impractical. We don't have trains because oil and car companies don't profit from it. Once you understand that things only happen in America, when some big multinational, again, this is kind of why I did the video and why I compared Canada and Australia, because these things were happening everywhere at the same time, right? There's nothing special going on in the US. And yeah, money is a big part of it. I've been doing a lot of research on this, and from what I found so far, it looks like if we go back to 1950, the USA, and even going back before that, household incomes in the US were just a lot higher. It's kind of hard to find equivalent data for each country for each year. So I've been looking at per capita income, GDP per capita, purchasing power parity, household income when it's available, median wages, minimum wage. Basically, it looks like the U.S. is pretty far ahead of the pack until the 1970s. And if we go back to that immediate post-war period, like around 1950, the U.S. would have been at the top of the pack. New Zealand would have been right behind, with about a 10% lower GDP per capita, and then the UK, and then Australia, and then Canada, surprisingly. But those numbers shifted pretty quickly. Like New Zealand's growth was pretty slow after that. Australia caught up pretty quickly, and eventually, overtook the US in the last 20 years. But, when all of this stuff is happening, personal incomes were just a lot higher in the US. Like, if you compare the US to the Netherlands in 1950, GDP per capita was like 40% higher in the US. So, like, of course, everyone is going to have a car. They could afford to. There's the room to do it. There's this huge baby boom going on, and everybody's living in cramped, crowded apartments that haven't seen like a paintbrush in 20 years. Everybody wants out of the city. Everybody wants a house in the suburbs. There's room to do it. And, and that part wasn't different in the US or Canada or Australia or New Zealand. All these things happen at the same time in all these places. There's not some big conspiracy keeping trains down. I think there was a little special animus around trains in the US because they were private for so long and took advantage of so many people that they had a really bad rap, and it was well deserved. If anybody's been watching The Gilded Age on HBO lately, I mean, it's basically telling this story, right, from all perspectives. and how the robber barons ripped each other off, how they ripped workers off, how they ripped landowners off. Yeah, by the time the 50s rolled around, people were basically thinking, yeah, they got what they deserved. We don't need them anymore. And Peter Marshall says, one of the reasons Australia and Canada didn't have the funds to build such a national infrastructure following World War II is that we spent the money on fighting in Europe, something that you were rather late for, and only after closing your factories in Germany. Maybe. I don't know if that's true. I don't really think so. Australia and Canada certainly have the money to build that infrastructure now, and they don't. And, you know, they certainly have the money to build high-speed rail from Sydney to Melbourne, and they don't, because it's not practical. The project's really expensive, and when you can only connect two cities with a, you know, combined metro population of like 11, 12 million maybe, even if you have like the route through Canberra, you know, if we're talking about 1950 and your country has a population of 7 million people, you're not going to build a fully grade separated interstate type highway from Sydney to Perth. It would not have happened in the US either. Like if, you know, if California had to build a north-south freeway in, you know, 1930, no, it wouldn't have happened. There was no money for it, and there wasn't the population for it either. Let's see. Interstellar Fred, USA political polarization, the hubris of exceptionalism, the arrogance of empire, transit railways are stigmatized as socialism. No. No. I don't think so. You know, I'm from New Jersey originally. No one there thinks that. I mean, okay, not no one, but it's not like a common opinion where people would call New Jersey Transit socialist. And, you know, there's just in my lifetime, just even in the last 20 years, there's been plenty of light rail built, you know, and the state is one of the most liberal in the country, and they still can't get it together to permanently fund New Jersey Transit. I mean, it's one of the few statewide transit agencies. It's the third or fourth biggest rail network in the country. It's nuts. But yeah, it doesn't really have a lot to do with socialism. It's got way more to do with our system of governance than anything, in my opinion. In New York, it gets especially complicated because you're dealing with this transit system that's split between three states, and getting all three states to agree to create an agency to serve transit for all three states. Yeah, that's complicated, and something that Australia and Canada don't have to deal with. I mean, maybe Ottawa does a little bit, but it's not really an issue outside of that. Topero. I appreciate the effort you have put into these videos, and I'm looking forward to more. Thank you, sir. I am working on it. Hopefully the next one is better than the previous two, and the one after that even better. Mr. Topero says, one thing I've yet to see clearly is how a series of choices and decisions ultimately derailed the streetcar. It seems to me like there's more of a domino effect and or a downward spiral effect than what gets conveyed by looking at independent and isolated decisions, often in a conspiratorial manner. Yes? Maybe? I don't know if it was a domino effect or a downward spiral, because the systems were never really commercially viable. They got by because a lot of like capital went into them, but from an operations perspective, they were never going to last more than 30 years without big infusions of capital. And I mean, we all know that capital had to come from city governments or state governments. The systems that survived in Toronto, in Melbourne, in San Francisco or Philadelphia is because they were, first of all, they were busy routes, they were well used, and the city governments intervened kind of early, before the systems collapsed, before it was too late to save them. He says, I think it would be an interesting thought exercise to retrace the decisions that were made from a hindsight perspective and follow down the hypothetical path. There's plenty of examples across Europe and Asia for inspiration. I don't know if you're if you're saying like a hypothetical path, if different decisions were made to save these systems, and I don't think we really need to, because we still have them in some cities. There's at least one example in each country. So we kind of already know what had to happen. And in most cities, in the US anyway, the intervention basically needed to happen like immediately after World War II. In some cases before then, like in the 1930s, because, you know, by 1940, they were already tearing out the tracks to scrap the steel. Yeah, I mean, if there wasn't any kind of city or state bailout before the early 60s, because the Federal Transit Administration was created in 1964 in the U.S., and that was because people saw how many systems were collapsing and it became urgent. Yeah, I would say if a bailout hadn't happened by 1960, then the system was pretty much doomed. But that's where your kind of hypothetical would take off from, say at some point between 1945 and 1960, depending on the city. Techno1007 says, not sure about other places, but at least in Melbourne, the transit staff held strikes and kind of just refused to let the service stop running. And maybe that helped in other cities too. I mean, that's awesome for Melbourne. I don't really know the history of other cities in terms of like labor organization around transit, but it does seem like by the late 40s, early 50s, political decisions had already been made about whether or not to save the systems, whether or not they were salvageable in the first place, and if they were worth saving. It seems like in the case of Brisbane with Lord Mayor Clem Jones, he'd kind of already made up his mind in the mid-60s that the trams were going, and it was only a matter of time. Matthew, I feel like that needs to be said with a French accent. Mathieu Faldis. Good work, Jim. Your videos brought a fresh angle to the urbanist genre. Keep up the good work. Thank you, sir. It's what I'm aiming for here. And I'm going to try to stick to every 2 weeks, at least for the next 6 months, at least until I step my editing game up. All right. At Fun17 says, I like public transport and watch this video for 19 minutes. I'm sorry. This is going to be a tough one. But I feel disgusted by your bloody disgusting way of talking. You should have just written far fewer downtown jobs instead of bloody real reason in the title. What the heck is real reason? You confuse viewers by saying bloody real reason. That's not straightforward. So yeah, in case you missed it, the real reason U.S. public transit is such a mess is a take on the Vox article, which I showed in the beginning. Maybe I should have linked to in the description. I guess I didn't. I guess I need to fix that. Anyway, yeah, it's basically the title of the Vox article, which is what inspired me to do this video in the first place. You should simply say people don't take trains because there's no railway. Fun17 is not fun. Is this like drunk commenting? I don't know what this is. No, there are railways and people don't use them because there aren't the jobs downtown. That's kind of the point. Well, one of the points. There's actually a lot of points. If you can't make your point within the first 2 minutes of your video, you're wasting viewers' time for the rest of the video. Yeah, I mean, it's not TikTok. There's a lot of topics to discuss. There's a lot going on. It's not really like a simple answer, even though some people want it to be. Talk a lot, but it's very hard to grasp what your point is. Yeah, there's no easy answer, and I've been studying this for 20 years. If someone's trying to sell you an easy answer, that's it. They're just trying to sell you. It's what?
I said I find the amount of times he says bloody in his paragraph essay bloody disgusting.
Okay. It is bloody unreasonable. Average viewers won't understand your video because your speech is too complicated, self-important, and arrogant. Okay. Well, I guess we'll find out, or I don't know, who knows? Maybe average viewers just aren't for me. We'll see how it goes. And there's 4 timestamps, and it says the sound of your laughing is disgusting to hear. Well, yeah, I'm doing this because it's fun, and I'm having fun doing it. And as soon as I am not having any more fun, I won't do it anymore. It's what it is. And then he timestamps the Flight of the Conchords clip that I used. The way you use that clip is bloody silly and childish. That Flight of the Conchords episode is probably one of their best. It starts off with too many dicks on the dance floor.
Too many dicks on the dance floor. Too many dicks.
And then it ends with Keitha. I'm not apologizing for that. You seem to have pseudo-religious following from like-minded urban whatever-ism weird people who can't do anything for average public transport users on the streets. Dude, I'm a brand new channel. Whatever few followers I have, I'm grateful for. Okay. Gandalf the Creator. Awesome vid, man. Fingers crossed for Adelaide to improve its public transport. Man, I was looking at the numbers for Adelaide and for Journey to Work, and they basically like pull the same numbers as LA. It's kind of crazy. Not what I expected at all, but it's basically like 85% mode share for cars and like 3% for public transit. I don't know how surprising that actually is though, because like Adelaide's just not a big city. It was even smaller 70 years ago. There's like an economy of scale to public transport, and it just like it's hard to maintain a big system in a city where every household has access to a car. It's just the reality of it. Lack says, link to a video about the lack of a tram. Sorry, man, I don't have my glasses on. It's LAOK. That's the username. There's a link to a video and where they're talking about how a tram extension to that particular point on the street in Adelaide would make sense. And saying I was complaining about this, it's just legacy stuff and a very few small extensions. South Australia is kind of just a mini America, freeways for days and a public transport system that breaks down. If you don't want to go to the city, there's a train line to nowhere. Yeah, a little bit to unpack there, but yeah, if you don't want to go into the city, there's a train line to nowhere. Yeah, super common. Even in Europe, it's not that unusual. Even the radial lines from suburb to suburb are still relatively new. So yeah, I mean, that before the car was on the scene, when transport was only rail, everything went downtown. And then South Australia is kind of just a mini America. There's quite a bit of this in the comments. I don't know why people use that analogy, because it's not really, there's nothing American about it. All this infrastructure existed in Europe, in Australia, in North America all at the same time. It's not really American. And anyway, freeways are German. Like, that's how we got them in the US. Eisenhower was in Germany and saw the Autobahn, and he's like, whoa, we need that. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like people see things that they don't like to call them American, when really it's just modernity. And maybe sometimes those things happen in the US first, but not always. I mean, I don't even know if it's half the time. Anyway, I think I might talk about this in the next video, or maybe the one after, but yeah, there's definitely a strong correlation between household income and car ownership. And there's this really great study from maybe 10, maybe 15 years ago, where they looked at historic incomes cross countries over the last 50, 60 years. And then also ranked it with car ownership. And I think, if I'm remembering right, what they found was that there's sort of like a really quick ramp up in car ownership that once countries pass a certain income level, it starts to go backwards. So like super rich countries basically drive less. You know, I guess countries like the US, Canada, and Australia are kind of just entering that phase. Oh yeah, relatively high mode share for transit. It doesn't also mean that most people take transit to work. Like it's not a straight line with Canadian cities on top, Australian cities in the middle, and US cities at the bottom when it comes to transit mode share. It's actually pretty mixed up. I mean, you're going to find most of the US Sunbelt at the bottom, but that's not really surprising because all that growth happened pretty much after 1970. When you get into driving to work on the metropolitan level, it is really mixed up. And it's great to be able to point to like a 40% transit mode share in your central city. Looking at you, Paris. But when you zoom out and see that only 20% of the regional population and 25% of the jobs are in that central city, and everyone in the suburbs is still driving to work, such that like regionally you still have an 85% car mode share, it's a lot less impressive. I know people get competitive about these things, so to be clear, I'm not saying that any one place is good and another's bad. I'm just saying that a big focus on downtown job capture can result in high transit ridership, but most workers will still be working in the suburbs and they'll still be driving to work. So Dublin has almost the same non-car mode splits as Paris without spending nearly as much money on transit infrastructure. So whatever the hell Dublin is doing, everybody needs to copy that. Yeah, seriously, their bike mode share is like 7%. That's sick. I have no idea how they did that, but I will be there this summer and I will let you all know. Oh, yeah, but taking a guess here, but housing costs in Dublin seem like they're out of control. And so if Dublin went and built a bunch of housing in the suburbs to bring down housing costs, I'm going to guess that those mode splits would definitely look a little different. And I didn't spend a lot of time discussing this in the last video, but I definitely should have. The U.S. Federal Transit Administration was created in 1964. The transit collapse was almost complete by then. We really needed it around 1947 when the total implosion was imminent. And not because we needed to save everything, but a federal policy and some federal infrastructure funds would have made a huge difference in holding on to the well-performing routes. What was needed was mostly one-time capital infusions for rehabilitation and modernization, but cities didn't have that kind of money. And this is the same time that federal policy is almost singularly focused on highways, which meant that states would also adapt their own policies around that. So without transit leadership at the federal level, you're not going to have it at the state level, so you're not going to get it in cities. And basically what we got was 17 years too late. And that explains most of the gap between the US, Canada, and Australia. There were some comments on like how Canadian cities are, I don't know, more communitarian, they are more dense. They are more dense, and especially over the last 30 years have done a great job of building up. It's also true that Canadian cities are like 10 to 15 years ahead of US cities for the most part when it comes to transit and sort of planning implementation. But I mean, like, the urban growth boundary in Canada goes back to the 1950s, so that kind of stuff is pretty far ahead. And like you don't see the same kind of urban rural interface in Canadian cities, in US cities, until you go out west where water is scarce and you can't build if you're not connected to city water. So like if you look at a map of Phoenix, you'll see a pretty hard boundary between where the city ends and the desert begins. And that's more or less every Canadian city. And you wind up controlling leapfrog development that way, and that naturally refocuses demand back towards the center, but it also makes housing a lot more expensive. And outside of downtown Toronto and Vancouver, dense urban living is not the norm. Most people in the English-speaking world live in a detached single-family house or an attached single-family house. Attached single-family is called a townhouse or a row house in most of North America, and a terraced house pretty much everywhere else. I'm from the mid-Atlantic region of the U.S., so row house is my default setting. But the housing traditions go way back. I'm probably going to make another video just on this topic, but detached housing is a historical and cultural norm in Northern Europe. Row houses only became common in the late Middle Ages as market towns and cottage industry started to grow. Apartment buildings are basically a Mediterranean export that the Romans brought with them as they expanded northward, but it never really caught on because it was unnecessary until the Industrial Revolution. When the Brits colonized the New World, they brought detached houses and row houses with them because that's what they knew, and it's also because that's how the cultural, legal, and family traditions worked. And even now, London is mostly a city of row homes, even if a lot of them have been turned into apartments. And that's not different, like townhomes or detached homes are the same in British Columbia, New South Wales, California, New Zealand, Ireland. Don't Get Lost 4078 says this entire video of comparison with Calgary frequently cited as having more light rail than contemporary U.S. cities. Ultimate cries in Quebec City. Yeah, I've heard about Quebec's struggles with getting their trams built. I guess 2 lines. I don't know a whole lot about it, but I've seen some news. Oh yeah, this is worth sort of repeating, but Noir Mortar says to add a little more to it, the U.S. interstate system was heavily based on a top-down approach to routes handed down from the federal government. Before that, our highway systems were largely built by the states themselves. After World War II, some saw the efficacy of the German highways and wanted to duplicate its speed here. Sadly, it has many adverse effects. Yeah, 100%. So I kind of referenced this in the video, in the first video, that the U.S. Highway Act of 1926 was a 50-50 funding formula for highways that states were already planning on building, that they just didn't have the money for. They sort of, like, I guess you could say, nationalized some of those state highways. Basically, the Interstate Act in the 1950s was basically like the Federal Highway Administration had been created. These are the highways that we're building. We will give you 90% of the cash. Build them. And that's what happened. Okay, Xavier Hutcherson says, nice job. Can't wait for part 2. Part 2 has been out. Not getting the traction as part 1. But I don't know. Could be the holidays. Could be me. I'm working on a better product. David Kaczperzik? David says the ADA killed the Pittsburgh trolley network. It was easier to change to buses than retrofit wheelchair access. Only problem with that is, like, the light rail to the South Hills, that was the late 70s, and ADA didn't come into effect until 1990. So I don't like, the problems were the same everywhere. Pittsburgh wasn't unique. Whatever problems it had going on was the same as everywhere else. Like, Chicago shut down its entire tram network just a couple of years before Pittsburgh. Oh, this is a good one. Inari28 says, just a note, Queensland is pronounced literally as if it was written Queensland, not a reduced lund. So in my accent, I'm going to say Ireland, Iceland, Maryland, Queensland. But yeah, I lived in Brisbane for 2 years. It's an unofficial Queenslander. When I was there, there was the 4X beer commercials on TV every Sunday during the NRL matches. There's some Queensland bloke. It seems like maybe he was a retired player. You just see his face on camera and he'd just be yelling, Queenslander!
Queenslander, 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 Queenslander! Queenslander!
Anyway, yeah, that's how I remember to say it. Yeah, I I kind of regret having a back and forth with Mickey Kareem 2201, really insistent that it's down to race or demographics or whatever. But again, no, because the same things happened in Seattle, in Minneapolis, in Boston, in Philly, in Chicago, in Montreal, in Vancouver, in Brisbane, in Sydney. No, it's a ridiculous premise. It's got nothing to do with that and everything to do with the infrastructure itself. I mean, even in the UK, the only places that trams are left are what? Blackpool, I think. That's it. Okay. EPM Tune says, excellent video. Excited for the next. Thank you very much. Yeah, so Robert Heinrich 2994. It's a good video. I'm eagerly awaiting the other parts. I'm here living in a city that was once amongst the largest and most important ones, Vienna. The importance since has diminished, but the public transportation is still excellent. The main reason why Vienna is still very good in public transport after World War II, economy broke down, and when others had their booming phase, where they ripped out public transport to get massive highways, Vienna did not have that luxury and was a bit stuck. So we kept the trams and upgraded with the subway system. Today, the tram network is one of the largest in the world. Another Austrian city has one of the largest trolley networks, so we know a lot and can help. Hey, I might need video footage from Austria. I've never been. Kind of sad about it, but someday soon. Yeah. I mean, I've seen video from Vienna, and it looks pretty amazing. I think you kind of nailed it there. It was about timing and money. Like, Europe wasn't doing it after World War II because the money wasn't there, and by the time it was there, people had enough time to think and say, oh, maybe that's not such a good idea. You know, we obviously can't fit these cars everywhere. There's a lot of good material on this that we'll talk about. Only This Moment asks, are you planning to say more about why suburban job growth took off in the U.S. versus the other two? And then I said I'm not going to, but then I proceeded to give a really long answer that said I'm not going to get into the details of it in this series. There's just not enough time. A good answer to that question has so many variables that I suspect that topic alone would take another 40 minutes to really cover comprehensively. Let's see if I can make this even shorter. Yeah, that just because like Toronto or Sydney have a ton of jobs downtown doesn't mean that they don't have even more jobs in the suburbs. So in both of those places, if you look at the whole metro area, most of the jobs, like 80% of the jobs, are still in the suburbs. People are still driving to work. It's just not as many. You can see that in the chart of mode split. Star Wolf says, oh boy, hammer hitting multiple nails here. The catalyst for the bulk of our woes here is most definitely how the interstate highway system was built. Most major cities had intracity expressways that were operated by their local city county roads department, or in some cases the state DOT. Yeah, that's a good point. And those roads were a lot smaller and slower. Yeah, just narrower. Interstate should have been made to start at the outskirts of these areas and go across the vast hinterlands until it got to the next major city. Yep. Yeah. Job sprawl is perhaps worse than housing sprawl. Yeah, and then the acronym DOT means Department of Transportation, not Department of Freeways. Yeah, I used to, when I worked in Pennsylvania, I used to call PennDOT the Department of Moving Cars Around because it seemed like that's all that they were interested in. But yeah, the job sprawl is big, and it's not entirely because of highways either. Especially if you look around the East Coast and Midwest, there are a lot of small towns everywhere. A lot of them got swallowed up into major cities, like they became part of the metro area, and the jobs didn't just move downtown all of a sudden because of that. Even though you have a big city like Chicago, there's still a lot of good-sized towns around it that always had their own little downtown. So you've got like multiple job centers, even going back to the railroad era. It's not because of cars, and I think mostly that has to do just with the size of the U.S. economy relative to those other countries in the 1890s, 1920s. There's a couple of people talking about the multiple tiers of government in the U.S. compared to I don't really know how different. I guess in Canada there's three tiers of government. In the U.S. there's generally 4. In Australia it's pretty much just 2. there are city governments, but they don't really do a lot. Most of the infrastructure is handled at the state level. Papa was saying this is very interesting to hear some context as to why we run these heavy, slow double-decker trains around the CBD here in Sydney. I have a feeling the new fast automated metro through the CBD opening next year will be a game changer. Yeah, I definitely think so. Only issue I see is how far out into the suburbs they're running that thing. Like, I'm guessing that if ridership comes back to what it was before COVID, that those trains are going to be full before they even get to the CBD. I hope not, but I think running a train like 30 kilometers out into the suburbs, like a subway, you just can't do that. You're going to have capacity problems. That's what your regional rail network is for. All right, I think that's quite enough. There's been a few more comments posted since I started recording this. Maybe I'll get to them in the next round. I'm already busy working on the next video. I'm going to give myself 2 weeks, but hopefully before then. I'm Jim. This is Urban Legends. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.